Imagine you're looking for a job. You've tried 30 different places and got rejected by every single one. You're getting desperate. So you apply for an entry-level job at KFC, and 23 out of the 24 people who apply get hired. You're the only one who doesn't. Your life has been a string of failures and you're not sure where to go from here. That was the situation Jack Ma found himself in when he was younger. And yet, fast forward a few decades, and Jack has become one of the most successful entrepreneurs alive and one of the richest men in the world. This video is the incredible success story of Jack Ma and Alibaba, showing how Jack turned his life around and built a giant global empire from nothing. But I warn you in advance, not all success stories have a happy ending. Today we know him as Jack Ma, but back in 1964 when he was born in China, he was given the name Yun, meaning cloud, and his beginnings were extremely humble. His mother worked in a factory production line, whilst his father was a photographer. They didn't have much money at all, and Jack was born at a time where entrepreneurship in China was pretty much dead. Around 90% of industrial production was in the hands of the Chinese government, and China was extremely isolated from the world, with millions in the country starving. At a young age, Jack Ma developed an interest in the English language and English literature, and he would regularly listen to recordings of Mark Twain on a shortwave radio. The problem was, he didn't really have any way to develop his English skills. But then in the 70s, China launched a new open door policy to try and get foreign trade and investments, and thus many tourists came to visit the country. And Jack used this opportunity to learn English. He'd wake up at 5 AM every morning and ride his bike 40 minutes to a big hotel in the city where many foreign tourists from Europe and the US were staying. Jack would give them a free tour of the area, and in exchange, they would teach him English. He did this for about 9 years. No matter whether it was raining or snowing, he'd always show up to practice his English with the tourists. And it was actually one of these tourists he met who suggested he adopt Jack as his English name. And from that moment on, he became known in English as Jack Ma. However, Jack needed to make money and was desperately struggling to get a job. He says he applied for about 30 different jobs, but every single company turned him down. When Jack tried to get a job at KFC, they hired 23 of the 24 applicants, but Jack was the one single applicant they rejected. And to be honest, at this point, Jack's life was a series of failures. He'd failed his primary school exams twice before getting to middle school. He'd then failed his school exams 3 times before graduating. And then he repeatedly failed the entrance exams to get into university as well. But he never gave up. He would always have the persistence to just keep trying until he got what he wanted. He was relentless. Like, he reportedly applied to Harvard 10 times and they rejected him every time. But in the end, he did manage to get into his local university instead, where he got a bachelor's degree in English. After graduating, he became an English teacher, and it's reported he worked for just $15 per month. However, by this point, things were changing in China. Private enterprise was no longer illegal, and a wave of entrepreneurs started popping up. When Jack saw this, he vowed that he would start his own business by the time he was 30. And he did. In 1994, at the age of 29, Jack created a small part-time translation agency. It wasn't really a commercial success at all, but it made Jack realize that running a business excited him much more than his career path as a teacher, and so he began thinking of other businesses he could start. Jack's breakthrough idea would come on his first visit to America in 1995, when Jack got introduced to the internet. And although he didn't really understand it, he was fascinated. A friend told him to search for something, but at first Jack didn't want to as he was worried he'd break the computer and wouldn't be able to pay for it. But his friend insisted. So Jack typed the first word that came to his mind, beer. The search engine showed results for different beers from all over the world, but not China. Jack was from a country of about 1 billion people, and yet there was virtually no mention of any Chinese products or services on the internet at all because of how closed off the country had been. At that moment, a seed was planted in Jack's mind that there was a huge opportunity for companies in China to do business with the rest of the world with the help of the internet. And thus, when Jack returned to China, he and a friend created a website containing info about various Chinese businesses. It was extremely basic, but the first day they put the website live, Jack's friend informed him they'd already received 5 emails. Jack said, great, but what's an email? The basic website they created proved there was demand for people in other countries to buy from Chinese manufacturers. And so Jack quit his teaching job and created his first full-time business, which he named China Pages. Jack's plan was essentially to build an online yellow pages for Chinese companies. companies. This online index would help Chinese companies create their own web pages to help them attract international customers. They officially launched in July 1995, and it was one of the first companies in China devoted to the internet. The only problem was that the vast majority of companies in China had no idea about this new internet thing, so they didn't really get the appeal. In fact, China had less than 1 million internet users at the time, but Jack had a plan. To help drum up interest in his new China Pages business, Jack began widely circulating a quote from Bill Gates where he said, "The internet will change every aspect of human beings' lives." Bill Gates had a reputation as a very successful entrepreneur by this point, so the quote certainly made business owners take more notice of the internet. The only thing was, that wasn't a quote from Bill Gates. Jack completely made it up. He figured that if people thought Bill Gates believed in the internet, it would get other people to take it more seriously. So, ironically, Jack knew Bill Gates would see the potential of the internet before even Bill Gates himself knew. Either way, circulating this fake quote was good marketing to get more people in China interested in the internet, and thus get customers for China Pages. One major problem still remained though. China Pages was too limited. It had text and images, but there was no way for people to actually make purchases online. It was just a directory of information, and thus China Pages couldn't charge businesses much for its services. As a result, the company was running out of cash. And then, to make matters much worse, a rival company then copied their idea and used the almost identical name China Page. Within a couple of years, Jack stepped away from the company and had to go and get a government job instead in order to earn a living. It looked like the whole thing was just yet another failure for Jack Ma. Even though China Pages hadn't gone to plan, Jack knew he was onto something, and in 1999, he gathered a group of 17 friends in his apartment and gave a passionate speech about the internet, and then pitched them on the idea of an e-commerce business, essentially a B2B marketplace that let Chinese manufacturers sell directly to buyers all around the world. There was something about Jack's conviction that was appealing, and they agreed to team up with him and put in a small amount of money each to try and build this B2B marketplace, and thus Alibaba was born. Now, the name Alibaba is pretty unusual considering it's an Arabic word, not Chinese. It actually comes from the folktale Alibaba and the 40 Thieves, and Alibaba is the character who uses the magic words "Open Sesame." But Jack liked the name as he knew he wanted this to be a truly global company, and the name was very recognizable and easy to pronounce in many languages. Plus, he figured a company beginning with the letter A would always be near the top of any directories. So, the team worked extremely long days and nights for many months whilst building this B2B platform called Alibaba, and even in those very early days, Jack was extremely ambitious and regularly gave big speeches to motivate his team. He'd tell them, "We don't want to be number one in China, we want to be number one in the world." Now, when Jack created Alibaba in early 1999, China had only 2 million internet users, but by the end of the year, it would reach 9 million, then 17 million 6 months later, and Alibaba was perfectly positioned to ride the wave of rapid internet growth in China. Their location also meant they could operate much cheaper. Jack's quoted as saying, "To keep one programmer happy in Silicon Valley, it takes $50,000 to $100,000. For that much money in China, I can keep 10 very smart people happy all the time." So Alibaba's operating costs were much lower when building their online marketplace. Plus, the good news for Jack was that in the late 90s, because there was so much hype around internet companies in the US, many investors were now looking at other countries like China for new companies to invest in. And this meant Jack managed to get a meeting with Goldman Sachs, who invested $5 million into Alibaba in its very early stages. Then in October 1999, Jack met with the investor Masayoshi Son. When Jack met Masa, they didn't talk about revenues or business models, they just talked about a vision of the future and what the company could become. Both men were similar in many ways, and some who observed them chatting described them as soulmates. They saw things very similarly and both liked to make quick decisions. After just 5 minutes of Jack's presentation, Masa-san interrupted to say he'd already decided he wanted to invest in Alibaba. Now, Goldman had valued the company at $10 million just a few weeks ago, but now Masa was offering to invest $40 million for 40% of the company, meaning a $60 million pre-money valuation. For Jack, suddenly having all this interest in the company was obviously very exciting, but even though it was a huge investment offer, Jack didn't want to give away so much equity. So he actually negotiated down and told Masa he only wanted $20 million instead in exchange for 30%. Masa wanted to pay more money for more equity, but he didn't have a choice, so he accepted Jack's offer. When Masa was later asked about this, he said it was the look in his eyes and an animal smell. I invested because of my sense of smell. And if you're thinking that sounds insane, welcome to the world of Masayoshi Son. But it turns out it wasn't as crazy as everyone thought. it was actually one of the greatest investments of all time, as that $20 million Massa invested turned into about $50 billion 14 years later when Alibaba had its IPO. But back in late 1999, Alibaba now had an influx of $25 million thanks to Goldman Sachs and SoftBank, which allowed them to really step things up and begin hiring plenty of new employees to grow the company. By this point, Alibaba's marketplace site had 150,000 members in 188 countries. Clearly, connecting suppliers in China with buyers around the world was working very well, and things were looking great for the company. Word was spreading rapidly about the site, as buying directly from Chinese manufacturers meant businesses could get some really low prices. With things seemingly going so well, Jack was actually thinking they might be able to have an IPO in a few years, meaning to sell their shares on the public stock markets. But very shortly after this, in the spring of 2000, the dot-com bubble began to burst. As many internet companies went bankrupt, the hype died down, and valuations of companies fell drastically. Before this, the mantra was just to grow as fast as you can at all costs. But suddenly profitability became the key thing investors wanted. And for Alibaba, despite selling up more than 500,000 users by this point, its revenue hadn't even reached $1 million. They didn't really have a clear business model. The company was creating a lot of value for its users, but capturing very little of it.
I remember many times when I go to a restaurant have dinner, somebody came, when I was trying to pay the bill, the owner of the restaurant came to say, "Sir, your bill is paid by someone." And the small note say, "Hey, Mr. Ma, I'm your customer of Alibaba Group, Alibaba platform. I made a lot of money and I know you don't make any money. I pay the bill for you."
Alibaba's rapid hiring had also caused all kinds of problems, as the right systems weren't in place and expenses were rising much faster than revenue. Thus, in 2001, Businessweek published an article with the headline, "Alibaba's magic carpet is losing altitude," suggesting Alibaba could soon be over completely. Was this going to be yet another failure for Jack Ma? Time magazine had even dubbed him Crazy Jack. However, in the years after the dot-com bubble burst and internet companies' values plummeted, Alibaba managed to slash costs and get much leaner and more efficient, while simultaneously increasing its revenue. And the most crucial turning point for the company came in 2003, when Alibaba launched a new website that would catapult Jack Ma to success he'd never even dreamed of. When eBay had its IPO in 1998, it had been a massive hit with investors, and in the next 2 years, its valuation grew from $2 billion to $30 billion. However, eBay wanted to expand into China, and thus they bought the largest consumer e-commerce business in China at the time, called EachNet. eBay now had an 80% share of the market, so it looked like they were perfectly positioned to dominate consumer-to-consumer sales in China. But then in 2003, Alibaba created Taobao, which roughly translates as searching for treasure. Taobao was a consumer-to-consumer marketplace like eBay instead of B2B like Alibaba's original site. Jack wanted the company to dominate in both B2B and C2C, and so he publicly declared war on eBay and had his employees dress up in army outfits one day as a symbolic gesture of the battle they were beginning. To get things started, Jack had everyone who was working on Taobao all find 4 items each to list on the sites. Even Jack himself rummaged through his cupboards to find things to sell to get some initial listings. The team then worked very long hours promoting and improving the Taobao sites, and Jack had his employees doing handstands during breaks to keep their energy levels up. However, the team were nervous that competing with the vast resources of eBay looked like an impossible task. eBay had far more money and a much bigger team, but Jack was adamant they could do it. Since they understood the Chinese market so much better than eBay, he famously said, "eBay is a shark in the ocean. We are a crocodile in the Yangtze River. If we fight in the ocean, we'll lose. But if we fight in the river, we'll win." In other words, they had the home advantage. For example, after eBay acquired EachNet, they removed features they thought were useless, but the Chinese people actually really liked them. Likewise, eBay's China site had the same design it used in the West, which was fairly clean and uncluttered. But the Chinese market found it boring, and were used to pop-ups and lots of bright graphics and animations. In contrast, Taobao was built by the Chinese for the Chinese. They understood exactly what Chinese consumers wanted and made a site that was uniquely Chinese, and thus it was much more popular. Jack also felt that eBay's policy of charging users a transaction fee was a weakness they could exploit, and he took the risky move of making Taobao completely free to use for both buyers and sellers. Instead of charging fees, Taobao would make money in other ways like selling advertising space or additional services to users. And this gamble paid off massively, because of course having no fees attracted more sellers, which attracted more buyers, which attracted more sellers in an endless loop of growth. Taobao also encouraged open communication between buyers and sellers, such as opening up bulletin boards and a live chat system so they could discuss deals. Whereas eBay, who relied on fees, were much more wary of letting buyers and sellers chat freely in case they made a private deal, which would mean eBay didn't get their commission fee. But perhaps the biggest blow to eBay's hopes of winning the Chinese market was when Alibaba introduced Alipay, its own payment solution with an escrow model that held funds securely until the transaction was fully complete, which massively established trust between buyers and sellers. By 2007, Taobao had a 67% market share, and eBay had lost hundreds of millions of dollars in its attempt to crack China. Jack Ma and Alibaba had beaten them. Jack also managed to get Yahoo to invest $1 billion into Alibaba, which only helped them ramp up expansion even faster. Whilst they didn't technically need that much investment, Jack's philosophy was raise money when we don't need it, because when you do need it, it's too late. Meanwhile, Taobao had become so popular, Jack later decided to split it into 3 different marketplaces. Firstly, they kept their consumer-to-consumer marketplace, which was like eBay under the name Taobao. This was where individuals could buy and sell goods to each other, and was like a collection of digital market stalls. Buying from here felt like actually being at a Chinese street market. You use Alibaba's chat application to haggle about prices or negotiate free shipping, and a vendor might hold up a product on a webcam to give you a live demonstration and sales pitch. On Taobao, you'll find pretty much everything, including some really bizarre listings, like one student began selling earrings made from dead mosquitoes, or you can rent a fake boyfriend or girlfriend for social events. But then secondly, Jack opened Taobao Mall, known as Tmall, which is an online shopping portal for businesses to sell directly to consumers, kind of like Amazon. Once again, you can buy pretty much anything, from groceries to cars. It's the largest virtual shopping mall in the world, and this is where larger and more luxury brands go to sell their goods. For example, Apple or Burberry. And here on Tmall, Alibaba does take a small commission on each sale. But then finally, there's also eTao, a shopping search engine to compare deals and discounts. So basically, whilst Alibaba was started as a B2B marketplace, and is actually the world's biggest business-to-business trading platform, their original site has actually been eclipsed by their consumer-facing websites like Taobao and Tmall. That's why Alibaba is such a dominant force in e-commerce. No matter who is selling to who, they own the platform for the trade to happen. And they also own the payment service too, Alipay, which is the most popular payment tool in China. Even many non-Alibaba sites use Alipay, and Chinese citizens use it for money transfers, paying for things in physical stores, even paying for water and electricity bills. But if you thought Jack Ma was just stopping at dominating online shopping, think again. In 2014, the Alibaba Group had its IPO on the New York Stock Exchange and raised $25 billion, which at the time was by far the largest IPO in history and put the company's market cap in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Jack became a multi-billionaire, and as the share price soared, Jack became the richest man in all of Asia. Jack actually encouraged his employees to sell some stock though, telling them, "You need a reward, you've been working too hard." Since then, Alibaba has gone on to not only dominate in online shopping, but also all kinds of different industries. They ventured into entertainment, music, hotels, AI, healthcare, sports, and they also own the largest cloud computing business in all of China. The company has become a conglomerate, acquiring endless different businesses, and by 2020, it was one of the largest companies in the world. What's really interesting though, is back when Alibaba was having its IPO, Jack launched another separate company called the Ant Group, Alibaba's fintech sister company. And in a slightly controversial move, he moved Alipay under the ownership of the Ant Group instead of Alibaba. By 2020, the Ant Group had grown to become the highest valued financial tech company in the world, processing more transactions than MasterCard and Visa. The company had also moved into insurance and wealth management, and processed around $17 trillion of payments in 2020 alone. And so when in October 2020 the Ant Group was due to have its own IPO, it was expected to be the biggest in history. I just want to reiterate that, as it's pretty insane. Jack Ma's company Alibaba was the largest IPO ever in 2014. Then in 2020, Jack Ma's other company, the Ant Group, was due to take the crown of biggest IPO in history. However, right before the company went public on the stock market, Jack gave a speech where he criticized the Chinese government. And that comment would change everything. In 2019, Jack Ma stepped down as Alibaba CEO. He said it was because he wanted to focus on philanthropy, but many suspect it was due to pressure from the Chinese governments. You see, tension had been building between Jack and the government for years. But the tipping point seemed to have come in October 2020, when at a conference in Shanghai, Jack Ma publicly called them out for lacking vision and saying Chinese finance has no system, and the lawmakers that enforce global financial regulations are like an old people's club. Then, days before the Ant Group's historic IPO was due to happen, the Chinese government ordered Jack Ma to Beijing to appear before Chinese regulators. Exactly what transpired at that meeting remains a mystery, but most assume it was for the government to reprimand Jack for criticizing the country's financial regulators. Shortly after, the Ant Group's planned public offering, which had already been approved, was abruptly suspended, with some saying the order came directly from China's president. The Ant Group was also ordered to restructure its customer financing business, reduce its money market fund, and form a separate financial holding company that would be partly owned by partners with close ties to the government. The Ant Group was also ordered to share data with the government and other companies, effectively taking away its main competitive advantage. The news wasn't any better for the other half of Jack's empire, as in April 2021, the government levied a record $2.8 billion fine against Alibaba for antitrust violations, accusing the company of monopolistic conduct. In addition, they ordered the deletion of Alibaba's internet browser from app stores, which at its height had 400 million active users. Now, here's a sentence that isn't said very often on YouTube. But in defense of the Chinese government, Alibaba absolutely did act like a monopoly. For example, it forced sellers to sign exclusive deals where they couldn't sell on other platforms. So the antitrust claims clearly had some merits. But that had been going on for many years. So why the sudden crackdown from the Chinese government? Well, some feel it was very specifically targeted at Jack Ma. After he'd publicly criticized the government, they perhaps wanted retribution. And not just that, they possibly wanted to just knock Jack down a few pegs, as they were concerned how much power and influence he had. Because according to polls, Jack Ma was better known outside of China than the Chinese president. And the Chinese government are obviously quite concerned about what info its people get. And so seeing Jack become so powerful, especially after he'd been acquiring a lot of media companies, probably meant they wanted to limit his power and influence. However, others think it was more of a state power play to reassert Chinese regulatory influence over private entities and big tech in general, who were seemingly getting too powerful. Either way, all of this combined led to Alibaba losing a staggering $344 billion in market capitalization in the span of just 1 year, the biggest shareholder loss in history. Finally, in a clear sign that the Chinese government was making an example of Jack, he was forced to step down as president of Hooper University, a business school he himself had founded. With his empire seemingly crumbling, Jack Ma then mysteriously disappeared from the public eye, prompting speculation of his whereabouts and if he was even still alive.
Jack Ma has reportedly not been seen in public for several weeks now.
The billionaire founder of China's giant online retailer Alibaba has not been seen in public since October.
Hasn't been seen in public for 2 months.
Whilst he has made a couple of brief appearances since then, like occasionally showing up at charity events, he's very rarely seen in public these days, and no longer active on Twitter. Due to the secretive nature of the Chinese government, it's unclear if he's in legal jeopardy, but it's certainly very unusual for Jack, who prior to all of this was constantly making public appearances. It seems pretty clear that China are not going to allow him to command the kind of power he once had. In fact, in July 2022, it was announced Jack was being forced to fully give up control of the Ant Group after pressure from the Chinese government. So what the future holds for Jack Ma still remains to be seen. But clearly his past is pretty remarkable. At Stanford University in 2013, Jack admitted, even today, I still don't understand what coding is all about, I still don't understand the technology behind the internet. He said he's a very simple guy with very stupid brains. And there are times when listening to Jack Ma where he doesn't exactly come across as some kind of business genius. There was even a viral video of Jack and Elon together where many felt Jack came across as kind of dumb.
Yeah, AI, I hate the word AI called artificial intelligence. I call it Alibaba intelligence.
Yeah, might end up being true. You never know.
However, Jack's achievements surely suggest he's a very intelligent guy, and it seems Jack perhaps prefers to be underestimated. When he was asked which person had most inspired him, Jack replied without hesitation, Forrest Gump. His interviewer paused, then said, "You know he's a fictional character, right?" But Jack explained,
Love Forrest Gump.
I love Forrest Gump.
But why do you like him?
Simple. Never give up.
Never give
People thinking he's dumb, but he knows what he's doing.
And so there you have it, the story of Jack Ma and Alibaba, how a guy who got rejected from 30 different jobs became one of the wealthiest men in the world.